Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Okay, so you're here because you want to get up to speed on what's really happening, right?
Wow.
But without getting totally bogged down.
Exactly. Quick, clear, and to the point.
So today we're diving into some pretty significant statements that came out recently from a top U.S. national security advisor.
Yeah, these remarks touch on NATO, Europe's role, especially with Ukraine, and, well, the broader direction of U.S. foreign policy under the current president.
Think of this as your fast track to understanding the, let's say, shifts in perspective and maybe the demands being made. We're looking at an interview the advisor gave.
And our mission, really, is to pull out the core messages from these statements and figure out what the implications might actually be.
Right. So first up, this idea of shifting the burden to Europe.
Yeah, this was pretty stark. The advisor apparently said the U.S. just can't afford to, quote, sponsor NATO allies anymore.
Sponsor. Wow. And specifically on Ukraine's defense.
The message there was very direct. Europe needs to take the lead on that. It really implies the gravy train is over, as they put it, regarding U.S. financial backing.
That phrase, gravy train is over, certainly sends a message.
It really does. It's a key takeaway, this focus on what they're calling burden sharing. The language suggests a feeling that maybe some allies in Europe haven't been, meeting their end of the bargain.
And they brought up the Red Sea situation, didn't they, as a kind of specific example?
They did, highlighting that the vast majority, most of the shipping going through there is actually headed for Europe.
Okay, so the frustration was that European navies weren't doing enough?
Essentially, yeah. A perceived lack of sufficient investment in their own naval power to handle those Houthi attacks, either independently or, contributing more alongside the U.S.
And they connected that lack of investment to potential problems for Europe itself.
Absolutely. A direct line drawn between naval spending and potential hits to European lifestyles, trade, their economies. Basically saying, look, this is in your own interest to fix.
Makes sense. Okay, let's shift to NATO defense spending then. This isn't exactly a new topic, especially with the current president.
Not new, but the emphasis is maybe stronger. The advisor repeated the call for NATO members to get their defense budgets up to at least 5% of GDP. 5%.
Which is way above the old target. And they mentioned that old target too, right? The 2%.
Yes, pointing out that even reaching that, quote, absolute minimum of 2%, well, many countries didn't even manage that during a previous administration.
And that 2% target, that commitment goes back a ways.
To 2014. The advisor specifically linked it to the first invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea.
Right. The argument being those events should have been a major wake-up call for spending.
Precisely. A wake-up call that, according to the advisor, wasn't really answered sufficiently by many allies at the time, where opportunities missed there.
It certainly makes you think. And the advisor apparently didn't hold back on the present situation either.
No. Describing the continued failure by many NATO countries to hit even the 2%, especially with a major land war happening now in Europe, as truly astonishing.
Astonishing. That's strong. Did they give any context on current spending levels?
Yeah, the average across NATO, and this includes the U.S. and Canada, was apparently 2.71% of GDP last year.
So the average is above 2%.
But averages can be misleading, right?
Right.
That 2.71% hides some big differences between individual countries. Some are way over, some are still lagging behind that minimum.
Okay, so did the advisor single out countries that are meeting commitments or increasing them?
Yes, definitely. Poland, Latvia, Romania, Denmark, and the UK were mentioned as having plans to reach between 3% and 5% in the next few years.
Okay, so some are stepping up.
And others too. Sweden, Estonia, Czechia, they've apparently pledged to get into that same 3 to 5% range between 2026 and 2030.
So there's a clear distinction being drawn between allies making the effort and those not.
It seems so. And that could suggest, a potential shift in how the U.S. views its partnerships within NATO, maybe prioritizing those seen as carrying more weight.
And the advisor reiterated the demand for allies to, quote, pay their fair share.
Yes, and share this burden fairly. They explicitly mentioned the U.S. national debt, $33 trillion, making the point that subsidizing European security just isn't sustainable for the U.S. anymore.
Was there a geographic element to this as well, like East versus West Europe?
There was. A distinction was drawn between the Eastern European allies, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and others.
Implying maybe more appreciation for those closer to Russia.
That's the sense you get, yeah.
Yeah.
A recognition of their heightened threat perception and, well, their more proactive defense efforts.
And alongside that, some praise for specific leaders.
The prime ministers of Norway and Finland were praised for taking on more burden.
But not everyone got praised.
Definitely not. There was some pretty sharp criticism aimed at countries like Spain, Canada, and Italy, described as appallingly unprepared.
Appallingly unprepared. Wow, that's unusually blunt for diplomacy, isn't it?
It is. It signals maybe a new willingness to call out perceived shortcomings publicly. Could affect relationships down the line.
And Canada got specific attention.
It did, yeah. Mostly about the timeline for hitting that 2% minimum. The advisor pointed out it was a commitment from a decade ago, and apparently it's still another decade away.
And that delay is part of why the president is now talking about 5%.
That's what the advisor implied, yes. But the comments on Canada weren't just financial.
Oh, what else?
Strategic needs up north. Things like bases, icebreakers for the Arctic, especially with China and Russia showing more interest up there. New resources, new shipping routes opening up.
So it's about capabilities and strategic positioning too, not just the percentage number.
Exactly. It adds another layer to what the U.S. expects from allies.
Okay, moving beyond NATO for a moment, what about broader foreign policy? Iran came up, right?
It did. The ongoing nuclear program negotiations. The advisor noted UN inspectors finding uranium enrichment getting close to weapons-grade levels. Still a major worry.
A huge concern. And the administration's stance on military action against Iran.
Well, the president has apparently assured that the U.S. won't be drawn into a war with Iran, despite, Israel's prime minister reportedly pushing for it.
But action has been taken against Iran-backed groups.
Yes, against the Houthi militants in Yemen. The advisor mentioned over 1,000 targets hit, 74 leaders killed in just the first 100 days of those operations.
So a willingness to use force selectively, even while trying to avoid a bigger conflict.
Seems that way. The advisor was quoted saying the U.S. is, quote, hammering the Houthis, and listed several goals: stopping Iran getting nukes, keeping Red Sea open, resolving the Gaza conflict, and securing the U.S. border. It's a pretty broad agenda.
Very broad. Any other specific mentions? Countries, initiatives?
Yeah, a couple interesting ones. Panama apparently rejecting China's Belt and Road Initiative was noted positively, and a positive view of Argentina's president, Javier Milei.
Okay. And looking ahead, any upcoming diplomatic moves?
The advisor mentioned the president's first trip to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE coming up in May. The hope is apparently for de-escalation, but still very cautious about Iran. Military options on nuclear facilities are not off the table.
Not ruling anything out there.
That was the final word, really.
Yeah.
The advisor stated that all options are on the table regarding Iran's nuclear weapons program and that the president is absolutely serious about it.
A very clear closing message on that front.
Definitely leaves you with something to consider.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.